This is the Talkin Bout The Hoosiers podcast, presented by HoosierIllustrated.com.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Talkin Bout The Hoosiers podcast, presented by HoosierIllustrated.com. I'm joined by Kyle Staley. I'm Drew Rosenberg. Big show today. A lot to talk about IU basketball. We're going to I don't want to say it's a mini episode, but going to focus on Mike Woodson and his, kind of talking about his tenure as head coach. It's now officially been announced Mike Woodson will be retiring at the end of the season or stepping down, fired, whatever term you want to use. We're not in the athletic department. I'm assuming he was kind of told the writing was clearly on the wall and he probably was like, I'm going to save face with a retirement. That's not, important. We're going to talk about his 4 years as head coach, because Mike Woodson, obviously, when a head coach tenure kind of ends, usually ends pretty sour. And this has been no different, but there were still plenty of highs. And before I even get into that, Kyler, how are you doing?
Good. I thought you were just going to keep going and not introduce me. How selfish of you. But I'm just kidding. But yeah, obviously the news broke out last week, became official that Mike Woodson's not going to be returning for next year. Obviously we were kind of at a point this season where the toxic level and just, the outbursts of the fans and everything like that was just kind of hit its breaking point. And whatever you want to call it, like you said, nobody that's listening to this, neither you or I, were in the athletic department or in the behind the scenes or anything like that. So we have no idea what actually happened. You can speculate all you want. Nobody for sure knows what happened except for Mike Woodson and Scott Dawson. So we'll leave it at that point. But I thought it was important to kind of look back at his 4 years as the head coach, playing career aside, NBA coaching career aside, looking back at his time as IU's head coach and talk about the beginnings and, the middle parts of it, the highs and the lows, and just kind of what led to here. So, and I think we can do a good job about it. So, yeah, that's kind of all I got to start off.
Yeah, you said it. There's, there's definitely been some lows. I think this season, last season especially, there has been a lot of lows. But there's also been some highs, and, it's good to talk about that stuff because, whether you think Mike Woodson, should be fired or not, I think we've both made it clear we thought the tenure should end like it's going to at the end of the season. There was still plenty of highs, and Mike Woodson obviously cares about this program. It's not like he came in trying people make him out to be this villain, like he came in trying to destroy it. He's trying to, be successful here. And obviously it didn't work out how many hoped it would when he took the job. But again, there were still plenty of highs. And I think I just want to talk about some of them. I think last night's win, I'm recording this Wednesday night, so Tuesday night's win at Michigan State, that is certainly a high, not just ending the losing streak against ranked opponents, first team to beat Michigan State at the Breslin Center all year, snapped a 5-game losing streak, and the cherry on top, Tom Izzo with a win would have became the all-time winningest coach in Big Ten history, surpassing Indiana coach Bob Knight, Mike Woodson's former coach. Izzo wasn't able to do that in front of, a bunch of former coaches. I saw Mark D'Antonio was there, former Michigan State football coach, a bunch of Izzo's friends, his son, a bunch of former Michigan State players, and just people who close to Izzo were around there and hoping, he'd get to break the record against the legendary Indiana coach's record against his former school, IU, and Woodson, prevented that, which was pretty cool to see.
That was kind of a fun storyline last night going into it because obviously Indiana's not been very good this last month of basketball. They came in, I think, 11-point underdog. So all signs just pointed. The pregame vibe, with Woodson not doing radio shows anymore, not talking to Don Fisher or anything like that before the games. It's just the pregame vibe was just it spelled disaster. But Indiana went in and, Michigan State started off hot. I think they got the lead up to 12 or something like that. Then Indiana switched to a zone and it completely changed. Completely took the script of the game and ripped it up and threw it right back at Tom Izzo's face in a way. So you got to give credit for Mike Woodson there. That's definitely the high point of the season so far. Yeah. That's their biggest win, the win that they needed. And it comes at a really good time because this next stretch, and we're not really, talking about the current season too much, but these next stretch of 6 games, they are very winnable. They can go on and win. They got 3 straight home games. ones that they could win. I mean, they got Purdue, a team that they showed that they almost beat on the road. UCLA is kind of a wild card, and then they got Penn State, who they've already beaten. So it was a good win, the win at the right win at the right time, I would say. And that's definitely, we talk about high points of, Mike Woodson's tenure. This is definitely a high point, considering the fact that nobody gave them a chance to go into this game and win. And it delayed Tom Izzo breaking Bob Knight's record. So, and it was nice to know that he didn't break Bob Knight's record on Indiana themselves. So
yeah,
definitely a high point there.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun, like, I guess, to watch the team fight because, we've kind of talked about it. It felt like there had kind of been, throwing in the towel, especially over the last 5 games. That it had been rough. It was really bad. I mean, the Woodson retirement announcement kind of came at a time where it was like, if you don't announce this when they play Michigan with Dusty May, a lot of people want to be the next coach of Indiana basketball. When he comes, it's going to be a rough kind of like homecoming for Woodson, which is, not what you really want if you are anyone in the athletic department, if you're on the team, any of that. So the announcement had to come, but seeing Woodson, they're still fighting. The season's not over. I know I've said it openly that I don't think they are going to make the tournament. But, 15-10, you just beat Michigan State on the road, which is a huge quad one win, one of the better wins most like a team can have this year. There's still opportunities, but Indiana's going to have to play almost perfect. To kind of go into football a little bit, kind of reminds me of the Cincinnati Bengals this year, where the Bengals were 4-8, season kind of over, and they had to play perfect down the stretch. They won their last 5 games, and it still wasn't enough. Indiana playing perfect down the stretch might not be enough if they don't win the Big Ten tournament, but the season's still not over, and there's still plenty to play for.
So, yeah, I mean, here's the thing, too, a couple things with that, too. Luckily for Indiana, they still are a team that has as much opportunity as mostly anybody that's in that kind of bubble area right now. So they have a lot of quad one opportunities still in front of them. And not most teams, North Carolina, for example, a team that's really struggled this season, that's very, very similar to Indiana, a basketball program school that, should be making the NCAA tournament. North Carolina's in that really struggle boat that Indiana's in. But if you look at North Carolina, they still got quad 3. They still got quad 4 games that they got to play, games that they should win. They hurt you much more than they help you if you were to lose those games. But Indiana doesn't have that. They got Purdue, UCLA, and then they got a West Coast trip at Washington, at Oregon, and then Ohio State again at home. So plenty of opportunity there. So the good thing about Indiana is the bubble is just really weak this year. And, you have your big dogs in college basketball, the Auburns, the Floridas, the SEC schools, really, Duke, obviously, those schools that are really just, taking care of business. And then you get to that kind of bottom part tier of that. The contract says you got to get an X amount of teams in, and there will be those X amount of teams that will be in NCAA tournament. So luckily for Indiana, they can take advantage of a weaker bubble group or whatever. So I think if you win these next 3 games and you sneak one of those road wins on the West Coast or whatever, and then you obviously take care of home against Ohio State, I do think that Indiana is on the right side of the bubble, and they solidify that by getting into the Big Ten tournament, winning a game wherever it drops, and just if they can go on a run, they'll definitely be in it. So the good thing is that Indiana's in the Big Ten. If they were in the ACC, it wouldn't be pretty, but they got the much needed win versus Michigan State, and that's the game that you hope is going to build momentum and get them into the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, and I guess kind of going back to Woodson, I mean, we talking about the NCAA tournament. When Woodson took over as the coach, Indiana had not made an NCAA tournament. What was it, 5 years, I want to say? 4 or 5 years?
So Archie Miller never made it, and Archie was there for 4 years. Tom Crean didn't make it his last year.
5. Yeah,
so
5 years.
It was 5. Yep.
And he did that in his first year, pretty much taking over Archie's team. I know he added, I think it was Xavier Johnson, Miller Kopp were kind of the 2 big additions. I think
Michael Durr was there too. Obviously, he's a big dude. So
big dude, not a big factor.
I think that was it. Yeah, because he brought back pretty much everybody.
Tamar Bates was added in that first class too.
Who'd you say?
Tamar Bates.
Tamar Bates, yes, that was his first big recruiting get. I think he was a high-end 4-star at the time.
Yeah, he was a riser too.
Yeah, and then you had a really good group back with Trace obviously leading the way, and everyone knows the story about that. Obviously, Trace was going to be out of here. Mike Woodson said, "You're not going to the NBA, man," and showed him everything you did wrong. And Trace had a conversation with his dad and came back. So a really famous story there. Then you had Race Thompson, Rob Finnessy came back as well, and then they had Christian Lander, who there was high hopes there at that point in time. So. He had a good team or whatever. I think the only key guy that they really lost from the Archie Miller era was Amon Franklin, and he went on to have a pretty good career at Virginia. Yeah. But I think Woodson did a good job when he did come in, getting that group back, and then obviously getting into the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I mean, Armand Franklin would have been so fun on that team because he would have been.
He would have been great.
He would have been the perfect fit alongside X at the other guard spot.
And then they also had Parker Stewart. I think we forgot about him as well. So he would have been definitely, because we know Parker Stewart really struggled that last year. That he was there. He's supposed to be a knockdown shooter, and he did not hit a lot of shots that year.
Yeah, I mean, but he took that team to the NCAA tournament, snapping the drought, and it wasn't like that there was a rocky season, but when it mattered most, they beat a good Michigan team. I think they beat a good Illinois team, and they should have beaten an Iowa team if not for, I think it was Jordan Bohannon, I want to say.
With that ridiculous shot over Illinois. Ridiculous shot.
But even that year too, Indiana hadn't beaten Purdue in like 8 or 9 straight games, and for Rob Finnessy, the shot you mentioned, Finnessy, that's another really fun moment. I know I want to say I was a sophomore at that time. Remember storming the court, it was one of the most fun nights. I think it was a Tuesday night too. In my IU as a student there, it was one of the best nights I can remember.
Big shot, Rob.
Big shot, Rob. That was Mike Woodson's team. Mike Woodson, that is one of the most special memories of the last 4 or 5 years for Indiana basketball, and Mike Woodson was leading the way.
Yeah, and then obviously that they went in to the Big Ten tournament. You touched on it, and they weren't really in. They were in that bubble area and stuff, but they needed to do damage in the Big Ten tournament. And I think they were down by as much as 17, 18 or whatever against Michigan at halftime. Came back, and we all know the story. Xavier Johnson put the team on his back. Yeah. Trace Jackson Davis started to become Trace Jackson Davis there. And took over the team, and the Illinois game, they took care of business. Trace was really good against Kofi Cockburn. That was kind of one of his big man rivals, throughout his career. And then they were just one really crazy shot away against Iowa from being in the Big Ten championship. And I think that they would have played Purdue that year.
Yeah,
I think so. That would have been fun because they split in that regular season. But Mike Woodson came in, and he was kind of the way people viewed him as. He was kind of that bridge. Where Archie Miller was an outsider into the program, I think it's safe to say. And he tried to come in, and he had a really bland style of basketball, and he didn't have the history to go with it. He didn't have the ties to it. And Indiana needed something like that. Obviously, they whiffed. I wouldn't say whiffed or whatever, but they didn't land a Brad Stevens or anything like that. So Woodson definitely wasn't their first option. But when you kind of looked at it, it's you needed a bridge, from the old guard of IU basketball to bring in the old fans and then the new style of basketball. Michael Woodson was supposed to be that guy when you look at it. And for the most part, especially those first 2 years, that was exactly what he was doing because you had the old guard, that loved Woody as a player, one of the best IU players of all time under Bob Knight, one of Bob Knight's favorite players. And then you had, a newer, hipper style of a college program, and obviously, Hoosier Stereo was always big with him. He's getting concerts, Gucci Mane, one of them, and all that stuff. So, there was high hopes at the beginning of the first 2 years or whatever. And I think, especially that first year, and Mike Woodson showed a lot of promise, and it's just unfortunate it didn't really, long-term wise, didn't really pan out the way that most people kind of wanted it to.
Yeah, I mean, it's, that second year we talked about it, Trace Jackson Davis. I know a lot of people say he, saved Woodson's job, whatever your thoughts on that are. Trace Jackson Davis had one of the best seasons of the modern era in Indiana basketball. First team All-American, if not for Zach Edey also having one of the best seasons in college basketball history, maybe he would have probably been the favorite for player of the year in not just the Big Ten, but the Wooden Award too. Trace Jackson Davis really had an argument for the Big Ten Player of the Year, despite Edey having an historically great year. And you see, I think we've talked about it in the past, but Woodson's ability to develop big. Trace Jackson Davis, you look at him in the NBA, his role is something he became a lot better of a passer, and he's found success with the Warriors because partly because of that. Like Trace Jackson Davis, when Woodson came in, like even the year before, the NBA was, he would likely get drafted and get a chance, but you weren't sure how his role, how his game was going to fit. And by his last year, I know usually older players, it's the opposite, but it's like, oh, Trace Jackson Davis very clearly can fit in the modern NBA game. And that is, a testament to Woodson.
Yeah, and I'm going to be honest with you, Drew. I hate the argument that when people say Mike Woodson's very lucky to have a generational talent like Trace Jackson Davis. I'll tell you right now, Trace Jackson Davis, his first 2 years at Indiana was really good. Really good. And he was a lot better than a lot of people thought he would be. Kind of that awkward size when it comes to the big. He's not skilled enough to be a stretch four, not big enough to be a true center, whatever and stuff. You got to give credit to Mike Woodson, and you really got to sit back and kind of swallow your pride. If you're on that kind of Mike Woodson was saved by Trace Jackson Davis type of thing, Mike Woodson developed Trace Jackson Davis, made him a real shot blocker, a real rim protector, made him an elite passer. And then Trace obviously just continued to work and, become that All-American that he was. I mean, he was the one guy that he got one vote, the one guy that made Zach Edey not a unanimous player of the year, and whatever and stuff. And Trace Jackson Davis, when you look at the modern era of Indiana basketball, he will be the face of that. And, under Woodson, he became he became a generational talent under Woodson. And it was because of Woodson's development with the bigs and how he was able to do that really helped Trace, and I make the argument that Trace is on the Mount Rushmore of Indiana basketball players. Yes, he may not have the championship to go with it, but just for what Trace did in those 2 years under Woodson was just beautiful to watch. And it was, it was nice to know that you had an alpha like Trace and you can give him the ball and he can go to work and he can do his thing. So, I think when you look back at Woodson's career and you look at Trace Jackson Davis, I think you have to tie both of those guys together because they really did complement one another.
Yeah, I mean, that year, swept Purdue. Hood-Schifino was, unbelievable as a freshman and grew a lot over that season. And, we talk about the highs and there definitely was some highs that people kind of like to overlook. But, I mean, the last 2 years, it's been mostly lows, and that's why Mike Woodson's, his tenure as Indiana basketball head coach it's not over, but it's over as, he's not coming back next year, but he's going to finish out the year. And I think a big part of it was, I guess, last recruiting class. I think their transfer class even is kind of what started it. Yeah, you brought in Khalil Ware, but Indiana, you looked at that roster, they needed shooting, they needed a guard, and he didn't bring that. He didn't bring it in. And Xavier Johnson goes down with an injury, and it's like, well, even with Xavier Johnson, I don't know how good that team would have been if he played the full year. I still think they needed guard depth, and now you're relying on a freshman, Gabe Cupps, who was not really supposed to have a role as a freshman and was supposed to grow into a role, over his career, and you're relying on him to play 30, 35 minutes a night. And I think that was kind of a big thing for people, like, hey, this is not realistic, this isn't good, and it wasn't. I mean, Gabe Cupps did a phenomenal job because he, I've heard the talk, it's like drinking water from a fire hose. Playing as a freshman guard in the Big Ten, especially an undersized one, as a freshman, it's very difficult when you night to night matched up with like a Braden Smith and Ace Baldwin, like those type of players. It's not an easy task, and Gabe Cupps was, essentially thrown to the fire. And that was, at least for me, that was a big gripe I had last year.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I want to go back to obviously the end of the Trace Jackson Davis era. Yeah. When that ended, obviously it was, well, I mean, Indiana played through Trace Jackson Davis, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the styles of basketball that you see nowadays, the successful group is you play through your guards, you play through your wings. Indiana luckily had a player like Trace Jackson Davis that they could play through at the center position. But when the era of Trace Jackson Davis was over with, there was a little bit of excitement for Indiana. And I think it was for Mike Woodson because, all the talk was wait until Mike Woodson can get his kind of style in, when Trace is done with or whatever. Yeah, we're going to miss Trace, but we want to see what Woodson can do. And there was a lot of hope that he was going to be able to play a newer, more modern style of basketball or whatnot. So obviously, the talk is he goes out there and his recruiting class, he gets Khalil Ware, which that was a phenomenal pickup at the time because that was a guy with untapped potential or whatever. went into the portal, struck out on some guys. It was kind of, his problem was that they put all their eggs in one basket. And when they didn't get that guy or whatever, they were kind of screwed in a lot of points. But they got Mackenzie and Baco late in the spring. You had a good group with Trey Galloway. Malik Renew was coming back into a more important role because Malik showed a lot of promise as a freshman playing behind Trace and Rice Thompson, respectively. And then you had Xavier Johnson, who was going to come back, hopefully healthy. He was going to get a 6th year or whatever. Obviously, Xavier Johnson got hurt again. When he'd come back, he just wasn't the same guy. He wasn't the same player. And Mike Woodson just didn't do a good job of balancing out that roster, especially when it comes to the guard depth or whatever. And it was a really awkward group. Yeah. It was just, a lot of talented players, a lot of individually talented players on that team that just wasn't put together right. And, you kind of looked at it both ways. You looked at it as, I think they finished 19-14 in that season. Didn't make the NCAA tournament. They had a really strong, end to the season or whatever, won like 5 or 6 straight. And it was just kind of like, man, you won 19 games or whatever and stuff, but this Indiana team should be competing for the NCAA tournament every year. And it was just a real struggle because they couldn't get any marquee wins. They couldn't do anything like that. They got blown out by Nebraska like 3 straight times. It was really frustrating, but there was a lot of people, and I think the majority of the fans, were willing to give Woodson another chance going into his 4th year. Obviously, the controversial, and a lot of people kind of look at this as kind of the start of the downfall. The true fans comment, on senior day last year. That's just kind of where it is because you put a lot of pressure on yourself. Like, okay, you're going to go into your 4th year. You better, back that up or whatever, and you better prove all of us wrong. And we're at a point where it's just they didn't do that, and they haven't done that.
Yeah, I mean, that, I guess it was weird that you and I were both in attendance for that senior night. It was weird. Usually it's about the players. It felt like a, almost to an extent, a Mike Woodson publicity.
It felt like Woodson. I think that's fair to say. It felt like Woodson, maybe not unintentionally or maybe intentionally. I don't know, but it felt like Woodson, not the players.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like it was all about, Mike Woodson deserves another chance. And I was very outspoken. I thought he did, and even going into the year, he clearly, I guess I want to say he earned it because, he did a lot of good his first 2 years. His 3rd year was a huge step down. But he had a massive recruiting, transfer class this offseason. I mean, there was a lot of hype around this team. They're top 25 in the country and deservedly so. I know we talked about on the wrap up, this team, it's going to be a team of what ifs, I think. But when we look at the end of the year, because they had chances, you beat Purdue, Maryland, Michigan, Northwestern, those 4 games. I don't want to say probably should have won, but had very good opportunities to win. This season's looked at completely differently because, you're 19-6 with a bunch of quad 1 wins. And no one's talking about the Bahamas anymore. But that didn't happen, and obviously it's led to Mike Woodson's retirement, firing. Again, not going to get into that. So it's, it's hard to, you gave him the 4th year. He, worked hard to bring the transfer class in to, get some hype for this team, but it just hasn't worked out. And it's obviously led to, the end of his tenure.
Yeah, this season was obviously a make or break year for Mike Woodson. And like you said, he went into the transfer portal class and he got the guys that he needed, or at least you thought that he needed. The dynamic guards in Miles Rice and Cannon Carlisle, the shooting in Luke Goody, another big, to replace Khalil Ware and Umar Ballo, and so on and so on. Got a really special freshman in Bryson Tucker. And then we also didn't even mention the fact that obviously there was a lot of gas on the fire going on when Liam McNeely decommitted as well. So obviously things were really, really rough during that 3rd year of Mike Woodson, especially towards the end. So it was a make or break year going in, and, a lot of hype. This team, we all know, didn't have the strongest non-conference schedule. And that was probably for, a lot of it had to do with Woodson. And that was, he wanted to have time to get his guys together and gel or whatever, going to the Bahamas. And I would say, honestly, I think that Bahamas trip kind of broke this team in a lot of ways. I was an advocate even when they were getting blown out by Louisville and Gonzaga when I was in the Bahamas, I was an advocate like, hey, remember Yogi Ferrell's senior year? They went to Maui, got blown out or whatever, came back, and then they won the Big Ten championship. I thought that was exactly what was going to happen with this team, and I'll eat my words on that. That just didn't happen, and you found out a lot about this team. You found a lot about, Miles Rice wasn't going to be as consistent as you wanted to see as a point guard. The two big lineup was not working, and Mike Woodson's rotations were not very good, throughout most of the season. So it's just a lot of things that just kept piling on top of one another. And, obviously the fan base seeing a bad group of basketball. How many times we've said it on the podcast, it's so frustrating to watch bad basketball. It really just annoys you. It makes you sleepy. It's just the worst. And that's what we saw a lot of times for Indiana this year. We know how much talent's on that team. Yeah. You can't just accumulate talent. You got to make it work. You got to make it gel. And Indiana hasn't gelled, for the most part of the season. It's been a lot of selfish basketball in a lot of ways with the guys, and all this stuff just kind of ties into Mike Woodson. Execution of the game plans never worked. And it's just a lot of things that kind of led to finally, hitting that breaking point, whatever it was that happened or whatever, but coming to terms like, hey, we got to go a different direction. And this sucks because I think a lot of people really did want Woodson to work out. I think after the first 2 years, the trajectory that Indiana was on, you really wanted that to work out, and it just didn't work out. And now you're back to square one. I think in a perfect world, when you look at the Mike Woodson era and you go back to, I'll say probably around the end of Trace Jackson Davis's senior year or whatever, you're like in a perfect world, the best programs, you let your old coach like Mike Woodson or whatever lead him until they can't lead him anymore, step down, then you have a really nice replacement coming up or whatnot. You leave gracefully. And that just didn't happen because it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. The fan base was more outspoken. And it was just getting to a point where somebody had to make a move, and somebody had to kind of relieve a lot of this anger that was in the fan base right now, and which kind of led to last week.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about the recruiting misses this year. It's, there's been a lot more. I mean, Boogie, obviously Liam McNeely's, the big one, but Boogie Fland was the guy a lot of people thought IU was, the leader in the pack for a lot of his recruitment. And ultimately you lose him out. I guess it was Arkansas in the end, but was Kentucky. Well, I'm just going to say Calipari. Yeah. Calipari beat him out. And then Derek Queen, another guy, we've seen in the Big Ten this year, another guy that Indiana really wanted. I don't want to say needed, but it thought he was going to be the guy, and you were going to have a trio of Queen, McNeely, and Boogie Fland come in to kind of help change the direction and get the program back on the track. That didn't happen. And then I think the nail in the coffin, the truth is, Sicily, I think, was always going to commit to Indiana basketball. I don't think the coach really mattered to an extent for him, but missing out on both Braylon Mullins and Jalen Harrelson, two in-state guys that you can't let those, both of them leave the state, and the fact both, or not leave the state. Well, I guess Harrelson's going to Notre Dame, but neither of them ending up in Bloomington, I felt was kind of the nail in the coffin for his tenure.
It was, because obviously Indiana, the state of Indiana, and I'm blessed enough to cover the state of Indiana when it comes to basketball. Absolutely blessed. At the high school level, it just means so much different. You can be a Class 1A team all the way down in, all the way down in Lagodi, Indiana, and people care just as much about it as up in here in Fishers, Indiana. And that's the best part about it. So obviously there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of passionate fans, a lot of basketball fans that, really pride Indiana basketball. And IU, obviously you want to keep the in-state guys and you want to build your program through in-state guys or whatnot. Things have kind of changed a little bit, with the NIL era and recruiting out of state or whatnot and stuff, but it still holds true that really Mike Woodson, it just didn't do a good enough job to land Mullins, to land Jalen Harrelson. A lot of that has to do with the style of play, I would say. And obviously Brian Walsh, he's been known as the guy that's been a really good recruiter for Indiana, recruiting the in-state guys or whatnot. Did a good job, I think, recruiting both Jalen Harrelson and Braylon Mullins. But I think both of those guys, and I can't speak for any of them, but I think both of those guys just kind of looked at the direction of what Indiana basketball is, the playing style. It didn't fit them. And Trent Sisley, I'll be the first to admit, I think Trent Sisley committed to the school. I think he did. And it wouldn't have mattered. Like you said, it wouldn't matter who the coach was. He wanted to go play at Indiana, kind of like Anthony Leal in a lot of ways, wanted to go play for his dream school. And that's what he's getting to do. So, of course, missing out on Braylon Mullins, missing out on Jalen Harrelson, and then the other guys like McNeely, Queen, Boogie Flan, those guys. Yeah, it kind of did build up to that, which is just unfortunate because Indiana lands, at least 2 or 3 of those guys might be looking at a different season because those guys were all special talent, and then Indiana just kind of whipped on them.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, Woodson's landed some major players in the portal. That's, maybe I don't want to say it's unsustainable, but you have to build from the bottom. And Woodson really, the last few years had struggled to do that, to get – it's not even just impact freshmen. I mean, he's had that in Baco, Hochefino, but it's consistently getting freshmen to where you kind of have that base and then using the transfer portal to add, the missing piece instead of trying to add all the pieces in the portal. And that's kind of what had been happening with Woodson missing out on a lot of these major guys.
Let me I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't know if we can kind of wrap up a little bit here too. Let me ask you a question. 10 years down the road, we look back at Mike Woodson's tenure, or what? It doesn't even have to be 10 years, 5 years down the road or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Do we look back at Mike Woodson's tenure and be like, that was actually as bad as what we thought it was? Or do we look back at his tenure and be like, you know what? Maybe we were a little bit too harsh on Mike Woodson. Maybe we were too extreme on it. I feel like that's going to be a fair question when you look down the road because there has been some highs. There's been a lot more highs than what there was in Archie Miller's era. I mean, can you honestly name one high out of the Archie Miller era other than landing Trace Jackson Davis?
Yeah, I mean, Romeo, I guess.
Romeo, yeah, and landing those guys and doing nothing with them.
Yeah, I mean,
with them. Mike Woodson did something with those guys. He didn't win a championship, but he did something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. I think where the program kind of goes after is also going to have an effect on how we look back on Woodson's tenure, as head coach. I think they'll be looked upon more favorably than Archie Miller's for sure. And obviously, so. But it's a hard question because, it's ended just so poorly. Which is the problem. It's, recency bias. People are going to, forget about those first 2 years. But when you're thinking back, you're going to think about, obviously there was a lot of good that, happened. Woodson was 3-1 against Purdue his first 2 years, including sweeping them his second year. Like that. I mean,
he might finish 500 against Purdue. If they beat them in a few weeks, he might finish 500.
Yeah, probably should have beat them But then, I mean, you look at the end of game situations and Archie's was terrible. I vividly remember how many games Indiana probably should have or could have won and just end of game collapses from Archie Miller-led teams. Woodson, first 2 years, he didn't have that problem as much. The last 2 years, it's really been bad. Not the inability to close out games. And this year has been the perfect example. I pointed to the 4 games that Indiana couldn't close out. And, closing out games like that, it's the difference between the good, the great, and the okay teams. The great teams, get it done, close the door when they have the opportunity to, and Indiana just has not done that. And I think that's going to be a part of Woodson's tenure that's kind of, remembered.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really fair points. I think with anything when you talk about the last 4 years or whatever, unless you're extreme about it in a lot of ways, I feel like there are a lot of fair points that you can look at. Next question I have, this will be the only question, the last question that I ask or whatever. Looking back at the 4 years of Mike Woodson's tenure, what's his legacy as a coach? What's his legacy that you can kind of look back on and be like, that was the Mike Woodson era?
I think we're going to look back as a coach. So completely ignoring his playing
career. The player, we know he's a top 5 Indiana player of all time, but just as a coach.
I'm going to say it's kind of what he was hired to be. I think he's a bridge guy. I mean, I think, when he was hired, I think a lot of people kind of thought those first 2 years was like, oh, maybe Kenya Hunter or Yasir Rosemond will take over after he eventually retires because, Woodson was an older coach when he took the job and he was, hired as a bridge guy. But with NIL and the way college basketball has changed, in the short time 4 years ago since Woodson, took over, the understanding of how to use NIL, how to build a roster using it from recruiting to the transfer portal, I think that's, it's been a learning kind of experience where the next coach is going to see what Woodson did and what he didn't do, and I think be able to build off that, hopefully, is, my optimistic personality is hoping for. And, if that's the case and the next coach, sees it and can build off some of the stuff Woodson was able to do, it could be, we could look at him a lot more favorably. But I think in the end, we're going to look at him as it's going to be kind of a, bridge guy era where it's a neutral. It's not like he was the worst coach ever because, following Archie set the bar pretty, low.
Probably
where, yeah. So, and Kelvin Sampson, had some success, but, set the program back quite a bit. Woodson didn't do any of that, which I think is going to be looked at more positively. And I feel bad because Mike Woodson has given so much to this program and he obviously cares so much. And I hope fans can, look back at him after, I guess, retirement a couple years from now, look back at him, favorably and realize, hey, you know what? Maybe he wasn't successful. And, he wasn't. He had a lot of goals when he took the job. He wanted to win Big Ten championships. He wanted to, go to Final Fours, and he hasn't done those things. But it's not for a lack of trying. And I think, it's not like he came in. It's not like Archie, who came in as kind of an outsider. Mike Woodson has, done a lot for this program. And I think if you looking at him as, I hate this guy, he's the devil, I think that's the wrong way to look at it when it comes to Mike Woodson. And I say this I've been very vocal this year that I thought Mike Woodson should be fired or should not be the coach of IU next season. And I don't want to say I'm happy for it because, it's a man losing his job. But I think the program is in a better direction now that we know he's not coming back next year.
It's in a better direction than what he took it as, or I should say, or whatever, where Archie Miller left it at. So I agree with a lot of that. I really do. I think the bridge guy is a perfect one to thank. You obviously, when you look back at his legacy, you're going to think of Trace Jackson Davis. You're going to think of Jalen Hoshafino's freshman year. You're going to think of the development of Khalil Ware. You'll think about those things.
Do you remember the suits? And his first year when he wouldn't wear suits on the road and they couldn't win road games, so everyone was like, "You wear a suit."
That was hilarious for the longest time. But you'll just look at. I think we talked about it with this season. It'll just be a lot of what ifs. What if they would have won these games? What if they would have landed this recruit? It's just a lot of those things. And, here's the thing. And, you people can have your opinions on anybody and stuff. Mm-hmm. The hate that Mike Woodson was getting, the absolute, you could just feel it through the tweets and everything like that. People got to get a life, man. If your life is defined by hating a coach, hating one man or whatever, and Indiana's not winning games, and that's your life, you got to get a life, man. And that's just kind of my opinion on there, and I'll leave it at that. So I think when we do look back, we'll look at Mike Woodson and be like, it wasn't that bad. Yeah, it could have been a lot better or whatever and stuff. He was stubborn at times. We could have fixed a few things or whatever and stuff. Could have executed a little bit better, but I think we'll look back and I think a lot of the true Indiana fans, the ones that really want to stick with this team and support the team or whatever and stuff, they'll look back at the good moments for Mike Woodson, both as a player and as a coach. So, but we agree it was time to move on or whatever. The bridge is already built right here. And I think we'll touch on, the hot boards and things like that. I know we got a hot board episode coming up, but I think whoever the next coach is going to be set up for major success. I think Scott Dawson will hire a really good coach. And I think this Indiana team is really going to take off in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Kyle, you ruined my teaser right there. I was going to, tease that next hot board episode where we talk about some people that could take over the job. I mean, Scott Dawson, he hired Kurt Signetti, which was, a home run hire. Yes, he hired Mike Woodson, but at that time, Indiana was not, the job is a lot better now than it was when Mike Woodson took over, and it's strictly because of NIL.
Yeah, and I think not to cut you off, Drew, I do think you have to give Mike Woodson some respect in this regard. He was the coach during this new transition era of basketball. He was the coach that Indiana had to lean on, and he had to adjust on the fly. So not a lot of coaches can do that. A lot of coaches just retired. Jay Wright, Roy Williams, Coach K. Jim Larinaga, Tony Bennett, those guys just retired because they can't handle it. Mike Woodson did stick it out for a little bit, and I think he earned respect there.
And I mean, it's typically, former players don't succeed as coaches at their school. I mean, we've seen Juwan Howard's, tenure ended terribly, and a lot of people are going to point to, he had a 1 seed or did that. Yeah, but you look at the team he took over. It was one of the best teams in the country after John Beilein left. So it's like Mike Woodson took over a team. Mike Woodson started at home base. Juwan Howard started on third base, and Juwan Howard finished back at home. Mike Woodson's probably on first base or second base right now. Like, he's advanced. Mike Woodson's gone better while Howard, destroyed the program, and Dusty May's come in and fixed it. But we're going to have Hot Board with Dusty May. Will probably get talked about on that Hot Board episode. Maybe have some guests. I'm hoping maybe Alec or maybe someone else. I'm not going to say who, but could be a special guest joining us for that episode. So stay tuned on the YouTube. If you're not already subscribed to Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube, make sure you're doing that. And for all things IU football, basketball, recruiting, women's basketball, make sure you're following Indiana_FRN on Twitter, Facebook, and check out HoosierIllustrated.com because we got all of that stuff covered. Our other show, In Touch with Indiana Sports with John Alden, great episode. If you haven't checked that out, do it. Zach Osterman on the show with John. So a lot of great stuff going on. Going on HoosierIllustrated.com. So make sure you're checking that out, and we'll be back next week with another episode.